September 15th, 1945. A gray morning in Cedar Falls, Iowa. A train hissed to a stop, steam curling around four German women clutching cardboard suitcases and propaganda leaflets that told them Americans were weak, lazy, and soft. They expected to find a defeated enemy, but what they saw instead shattered everything they believed. Standing on the platform was Frank Harrison, a farmer built like the land itself. His arms moved like machines as he lifted feed sacks heavier than the women's suitcases. His wife, Mary, a Chinese-American nurse, worked beside him with quiet command, speaking English with precision and dignity. To these German women, raised on Nazi lies about inferior Americans, this moment was like watching their world turn upside down. They had survived bombings, loss, and shame, but nothing prepared them for the mercy, strength, and humanity waiting in the heart of America's farmlands. Because what they found in Iowa wasn't revenge, it was forgiveness. If stories like this move you, stories about humanity shining through the ashes of war, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves real history that feels alive. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten moments like this, where enemies became neighbors and hope quietly returned to a broken world. The train hissed like a tired beast settling into its final breath. Steam wrapped around the iron wheels, blurring the faces of the passengers who peered out, unsure what waited beyond the smoke. Greta Miller stepped down first, clutching a small cardboard suitcase that felt heavier than it should. Inside were two dresses, a photograph of her dead husband, and a leaflet filled with comforting lies. The September air carried the scent of ripening corn and wet iron. It smelled nothing like home, nothing like the bombed streets of Hamburg that still burned behind her eyelids when she closed them. Three other women followed, Ingrid, Helga, and Liesel, each wearing the same cautious posture of people expecting judgment. They had been told they were enemies, and America would never forgive them. But Cedar Falls didn't look like a place that hated. The sky was wide, the land golden, and the silence so thick it pressed against their thoughts, making them wonder if peace could feel like this. The propaganda leaflets in their pockets had promised another America. Weak men with soft bellies, lazy workers who lived off others' labor. Lies printed in ink, but believed in blood. Then Greta saw him. 50 feet away, a man was lifting sacks of feed onto a truck, each one nearly as heavy as a grown man. He moved with effortless rhythm, like a machine made of muscle and will. His shirt clung to his back, stretched across shoulders shaped by years of work, not vanity. The sunlight caught the sweat on his arms, and suddenly every poster she'd memorized back home seemed ridiculous. In that instant, the women stopped walking. They stared, not in fear or attraction, but in disbelief. Everything they'd been taught about America, its people, its weakness, crumbled beneath the sight of one farmer. The train hissed like a tired beast settling into its final breath. Steam wrapped around the iron wheels, blurring the faces of the passengers who peered out, unsure what waited beyond the smoke. Greta Miller stepped down first, clutching a small cardboard suitcase that felt heavier than it should. Inside were two dresses, a photograph of her dead husband, and a leaflet filled with comforting lies. The September air carried the scent of ripening corn and wet iron. It smelled nothing like home, nothing like the bombed streets of Hamburg that still burned behind her eyelids when she closed them. Three other women followed, Ingrid, Helga, and Liesel, each wearing the same cautious posture of people expecting judgment. They had been told they were enemies, and America would never forgive them. But Cedar Falls didn't look like a place that hated. The sky was wide, the land golden, and the silence so thick it pressed against their thoughts, making them wonder if peace could feel like this. The propaganda leaflets in their pockets had promised another America. Weak men with soft bellies, lazy workers who lived off others' labor, lies printed in ink but believed in blood. Then Greta saw him. 50 feet away, a man was lifting sacks of feed onto a truck, each one nearly as heavy as a grown man. He moved with effortless rhythm, like a machine made of muscle and will. His shirt clung to his back, stretched across shoulders, shaped by years of work, not vanity. The sunlight caught the sweat on his arms, and suddenly every poster she'd memorized back home seemed ridiculous. In that instant, the women stopped walking. They stared, not in fear or attraction, but in disbelief. Everything they'd been taught about America, its people, its weakness, crumbled beneath the sight of one farmer. A voice broke the silence. "You must be the new arrivals." A woman stepped from the truck, Chinese-American, hair pinned neatly, her sleeves rolled up. Her tone carried authority softened by warmth. "I'm Mary Harrison," she said. "We had trouble with a cow this morning. That's why we're late." Her English was perfect, calm, steady, not the submissive caricature the Reich had promised them. Behind her, Frank Harrison nodded, touching the brim of his cap. "Ma'am," he said simply, acknowledging each woman in turn, not with disdain, not with fear, just respect, plain and unspoken. Greta's pulse quickened. She had been prepared for contempt, for the hostility of victors. Instead, she found herself disarmed by courtesy. The world had ended. And yet, somehow, decency survived in Iowa. Frank lifted their luggage with one hand as if the weight meant nothing. His hands were scarred, his knuckles rough as old wood. Yet when Ingrid stumbled, his grip was gentle, almost reverent. No one spoke on the drive through the Iowa countryside. Golden fields stretched endlessly on either side, punctuated by red barns and white farmhouses that gleamed like hope after rain. Greta pressed her forehead to the truck window, watching the landscape roll by like a dream painted in color after years of gray. Abundance was everywhere, in the crops, the houses, the air itself. Mary glanced back once, offering a small smile. "It's not much," she said. But to Greta, it was everything. A world built on labor and mercy instead of conquest and pride. As the truck turned up a gravel road toward the Harrison farm, Greta felt something strange rise in her chest. It wasn't fear or guilt or even shame. It was the first fragile spark of wonder. The paper showed Americans lounging on sofas, surrounded by machines that did their work for them. Men with soft hands, women painted in makeup, all smiling as others fought their battles. She remembered how confidently her husband had laughed at these images. "They have no strength," he'd said, polishing his boots before deployment. "They build comfort, not courage." It had sounded so certain back then. But Frank Harrison's arms had rewritten that lie with every motion, every quiet act of endurance. His silence, his discipline. They had more power than any shouted slogan or military speech. In the darkness, Greta listened to the crickets and distant lowing of cattle. The night hummed with life, not despair. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of the quiet. In Hamburg, silence meant danger. Air raids, police footsteps, the sudden loss of a neighbor. Here, silence meant peace, work completed, the land breathing calmly beneath the stars. The farm smelled of hay, oil, and baked earth, not ashes. When Greta closed her eyes, she tried to imagine the journey that had brought her from a shattered city to this living world. Her fingers traced the edge of her husband's photograph. Heinrich looked back, handsome and proud in his uniform. How small that pride seemed now, how fragile against the strength she'd seen in strangers' eyes. The next morning, Mary met her in the yard, sleeves rolled up, hair tucked beneath a scarf. "We start with milking," she said, handing Greta a pail. No lectures, no scorn, just work. Greta followed, hands trembling slightly as she learned the rhythm of the barn. The cows shifted, their warmth filling the air, their calm eyes reflecting something ancient. Patience, perhaps forgiveness. Mary moved beside her. efficient and kind. "Don't worry about mistakes," she said. "Everyone learns by doing." Greta froze at the words, unused to a world where mistakes didn't invite punishment. In that barn, she realized the difference between obedience and learning, between fear and respect, between the Germany she had fled and the America she was still trying to understand. At noon, Mary called her inside for lunch. The kitchen smelled of bread and roasted corn. Greta hesitated at the doorway, unsure if she belonged among these people who had every reason to hate her. Frank was already seated, removing his hat before eating. "Sit," he said simply, gesturing toward an empty chair. His tone wasn't commanding, just inviting, as if decency were the most natural thing in the world. Greta ate slowly, unsure whether to speak. Mary filled the silence with gentle conversation about crops, weather, and the town's harvest fair. Ordinary things, spoken without fear. It felt impossibly human. Later, as she washed the dishes, Greta's eyes fell again on the propaganda leaflet tucked into her pocket. She felt the urge to tear it apart, to destroy the paper that had deceived her heart. Instead, she folded it neatly and placed it inside her suitcase, beside Heinrich's photograph. Both belonged to the same world now, a world built on lies, fading beneath the light of truth. When the sun dipped below the Iowa horizon, Greta stepped outside and watched the golden fields burn with evening light. The wind brushed her face softly, carrying the promise of something she'd forgotten existed: forgiveness. Morning arrived wrapped in mist that glowed pale gold over the fields. Roosters crowed in the distance, and the rhythmic hum of the windmill filled the dawn with a patient, steady pulse. Greta woke before sunrise, drawn by the strange urge to belong. She dressed quietly, tying her hair beneath a kerchief like Mary's, and stepped outside into air cool enough to sting her cheeks. The farm was already alive. Frank carried buckets as if they weighed nothing, his boots leaving deep prints in the dirt. Every motion he made had purpose, precise, deliberate, without waste. Watching him, Greta felt an unexpected respect. There was dignity in the way he moved, the way he treated every task, no matter how small, as something worthy of his full attention. In Germany, labor had been shouted into people, demanded, enforced, never honored. Here, work was something else entirely, a language that spoke of pride rather than punishment. Mary joined them with 2 steaming mugs of coffee, her face softened by the early light. "No one rushes the day here," she said. "The sun will move when it's ready." Greta smiled faintly, surprised by the warmth in Mary's voice. It was strange how easily kindness disarmed her, how it left her both grateful and unsteady, like a soldier learning peace for the first time. By mid-morning, the fields shimmered with heat. The smell of tilled soil and corn hung thick in the air, and Greta's arms ached pleasantly from carrying feed. She didn't mind the ache. It felt earned. Frank taught without words. He showed her how to hold the plow handles steady, how to guide the horses gently rather than pulling hard. Patience, not power, seemed to be his creed. Once, when Greta fumbled a latch and a calf darted loose, she froze, expecting anger. But Frank only chuckled, cornering the animal calmly. "You'll catch him next time," he said, voice even as steady rain. It unnerved her, that mercy. Forgiveness without condition felt heavier than punishment. It made her confront a truth she'd long buried, that cruelty had never made anyone stronger, only afraid. At noon, they rested beneath an oak tree. Mary unpacked bread, cheese, and cold apples from a tin pail. They ate in silence, broken only by the buzz of insects and distant tractors. The food tasted better than anything Greta remembered from home, perhaps because it came without fear. Every bite carried the quiet satisfaction of work shared, not demanded. After lunch, Frank led her to the workshop, where wooden tools hung neatly along the walls. "Order keeps the farm alive," he said. "A mess steals time you can't get back." He wasn't lecturing, just sharing wisdom learned from the soil. Greta nodded, running her fingers along the worn handles of tools that had built a life out of earth and sweat. As dusk fell, the fields turned copper beneath the fading sun. Greta stood by the fence, watching shadows stretch across the land. For the first time, the world didn't feel hostile, just vast and alive. That night, as crickets sang outside her window, Greta lay awake replaying the day's rhythm. The honest labor, the unspoken trust, the strange peace that settled deep in her chest like a seed. In the quiet of that Iowa night, she realized something simple and terrifying. Strength wasn't what the Reich had preached. It wasn't domination or fear. It was kindness with calloused hands, steady and unbreakable. And as the wind whispered through the cornfields, Greta Muller, widow, prisoner, stranger, began to believe that perhaps even the most broken soul could take root in new soil and grow again. The first frost came early that October, silvering the fences and catching the breath of cattle like smoke. The mornings were colder now, sharper, but the rhythm of the farm never faltered. Greta's hands had grown rough from milking, her shoulders strong from lifting, yet she still flinched at sudden noises. A slammed door, a dropped tool, the echo of old commands burned into memory. One morning, she spilled an entire bucket of milk across the barn floor. The sound froze her completely. Instinct braced her for the blow she'd always known would follow. But none came. Frank appeared in the doorway, steady as ever. He surveyed the mess, then handed her a rag. "Hook slipped, didn't it?" he said. "Tomorrow you'll get it right." Then he walked away. Greta stared after him, stunned by the quiet mercy of the moment. No shouting, no shame, no punishment, just simple acknowledgement and the space to try again. That night, she sat by the small oil lamp in her room, hands trembling around the bread she'd baked. The silence felt heavy, not from fear, but from something far more unfamiliar. Safety. She thought of her father's belt, her husband's temper, the camp overseer's voice cracking like thunder. Her body still remembered each strike, each flinch, each moment when silence meant danger. Now, silence meant trust. It meant that mistakes didn't define worth, that learning was allowed. The realization moved through her like warmth after frostbite, painful at first, then healing. The next morning, Mary found her sweeping the porch before dawn. "You don't have to start this early," Mary said, smiling softly. Greta only shrugged. "If I work, I don't think." Mary studied her for a moment, understanding more than she said. "Then work with purpose," she replied. "Not to forget, but to build something new." Her voice carried quiet conviction, like scripture. The days grew shorter, the sky lower, the farm busier with preparations for winter. Greta threw herself into labor, hauling hay, scrubbing barns, mending fences, until her muscles learned peace through exhaustion. Sometimes Frank spoke to her while they worked. Never about the war, never about the past, only about weather, crops, the stubbornness of cows. Small talk that made ordinary life feel extraordinary. She noticed the way he treated everyone the same. His wife, the hired men, even the mail carrier. Respect wasn't reserved for rank or blood. It was given freely, a habit carved into him. Once, as dusk fell, she watched him repair a fence by lantern light. His silhouette moved slowly against the glow, patient and deliberate, as if fixing wood could also mend the world. In those quiet moments, Greta felt something uncoil inside her, a memory of gentleness long forgotten. Perhaps strength was not the power to dominate, but the will to remain kind. On Sundays, the Harrisons allowed her rest. She would sit by the window, knitting or reading one of Mary's English books, her tongue tripping over unfamiliar words that began to sound like home. The silence between them became its own language, one of trust and rhythm, of shared labor and unspoken understanding. It was the first silence in her life that didn't demand apology. When winter wind rattled the farmhouse at night, Greta would pull the blanket tighter around her shoulders, whispering a quiet promise to herself that she would never fear the quiet again. And outside, beyond her small window, Iowa slept under a thin white frost, a land where forgiveness had roots and where silence, once terrifying, had finally learned how to sing. The morning broke pale and thin, the sun rising reluctantly through a veil of frost. Mary was already awake, her movements measured and precise, every task completed with quiet assurance, born from repetition. Greta watched her from the doorway, fascinated by the stillness that seemed to surround her. Mary moved like water, calm and certain, flowing around every obstacle without losing her grace or direction. In the barn, she spoke softly to the animals, her words a blend of English and something else, melodic, unfamiliar but comforting. Greta later learned it was Mandarin, a language Mary never abandoned. During a break, Greta gathered the courage to ask, "You were born here?" Mary nodded. "Iowa," she said simply. But people didn't always believe that. Her tone held no anger, only the weight of memory. As they stacked hay together, Mary told fragments of her story. How her parents ran a grocery in town before the war, how windows shattered after Pearl Harbor, how fear turned neighbors into strangers overnight. "They said people like me couldn't be trusted," Mary said, eyes steady. "So I learned to be useful, nurse, translator, anything that made me harder to discard." Her words were matter of fact, not bitter. Greta listened, the rhythm of work slowing as she realized Mary carried scars of her own, different from bombs or hunger, but carved by suspicion, by the quiet cruelty of judgment. Frank appeared briefly, wiping sweat from his brow. "You two talking history again?" he teased gently. Mary smiled. "It's good for her to know she's not the only outsider here." Frank nodded and walked on. The exchange lingered in Greta's mind all afternoon. Mercy, she realized, didn't come from ignorance. It came from understanding what it meant to be misjudged and choosing compassion anyway. That evening, a cow went into labor in the far pasture. Mary grabbed her medical kit and ran, Greta close behind. The wind was sharp, the ground slick with early frost and mud. The heifer was panicked, the calf turned wrong. Greta froze, unsure what to do, but Mary knelt without hesitation, arms deep in the struggle, murmuring softly in Mandarin as if coaxing the world itself. When it was over, both mother and calf breathed again. Mary sat back, streaked with sweat and blood, her eyes shining not with triumph but with relief. "Life," she whispered, "always insists on continuing." Greta helped her wash at the pump afterward. The water ran pink, then clear. Mary looked up at her, smiling faintly. "I used to think survival was enough," she said. "Now I think healing matters more." That night, Greta couldn't sleep. She replayed Mary's calm in crisis, her steady courage. The Reich had spoken of strength as conquest, but here it looked like patience, compassion, and skill born of pain. In the following days, Mary taught her how to stitch wounds, how to recognize infection, how to read the signs of life returning. "Even broken things," she said once, "can grow strong if tended right." They became quiet companions in the long workdays. Greta learned that Mary's laughter was rare but real, that she hummed old Chinese lullabies while canning fruit, and that she trusted slowly, like someone who'd learned to expect loss. Greta began to see her not as an American wife, but as a mirror. Another woman shaped by war and prejudice, building a fragile peace from the remnants of something once cruel. By the time the frost melted from the fields, Greta understood that Mary's strength wasn't loud or dramatic. It lived in her hands, her patience, her refusal to let the world make her hard. And in that quiet strength, Greta found the first true example of freedom she'd ever known. Not the kind printed on flags or shouted in speeches, but the kind that simply refuses to hate. The first thaw came with a whisper, not a roar. Snow melted into the black soil, releasing the scent of life returning. The farm stirred awake, and with it, something inside Greta did too. She had grown used to the rhythm now, the measured clank of pails, the soft lowing of cows, the creak of barn doors opening to another day. It all felt steady, earned, real. One morning, she found Frank and Mary arguing, not with raised voices, but with purpose. "If we rotate the north field now, the soil won't hold moisture," Mary insisted. Frank rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Greta hesitated at the doorway, unsure whether to step in, until Frank turned and asked, "What do you think, Greta?" The question stunned her. In Germany, no man had ever asked her opinion about land. Her first instinct was silence, but Mary's encouraging nod made her speak. "The lower fields drain better. Maybe they dry slower." Frank's lips twitched, a half smile, half surprise. "Sounds right to me." It was a small exchange, yet it rippled through Greta like lightning. To be treated as someone whose thoughts mattered, not merely tolerated, that was a kind of power she'd never known. Later that afternoon, she helped Mary mend harness straps by the stove. "He asks because he respects you," Mary said gently. "That's how partnership works here. Not one commanding the other, both listening." Greta's hands stilled on the leather. Partnership. The word felt foreign in her mouth, heavier than she expected. She thought of Heinrich, his orders, his anger, his certainty that obedience was love. The longer she stayed, the more she saw how the Harrisons moved through life like dancers who knew each other's steps. Mary would hand Frank tools before he asked. Frank would finish her thought mid-sentence. When disagreements came, they discussed them, quietly, firmly, as equals. No slammed doors, no fear in Mary's eyes. Their home was not ruled by dominance, but by balance, born of mutual respect. Greta began to wonder how many women in Germany had mistaken submission for safety. How many had believed that silence was the price of love. She had believed it once too. That evening, Frank repaired a plow while Greta held the lantern. Sparks flew from his file, lighting his face in flickers of orange. Without looking up, he said softly, "You're wondering why we don't hate you." The words cut through the hum of night. Greta's heart stuttered. She had never dared to ask, yet the question had haunted every moment since she arrived in Cedar Falls. Frank finally looked up, his eyes steady. "Hate's a luxury," he said. "Takes energy I'd rather spend building things that last. Hate doesn't feed the cattle, doesn't grow corn, doesn't fix what's broken." Greta felt her throat tighten. He wasn't excusing the past, only refusing to live inside it. In that barn, surrounded by sawdust and tools, she understood mercy as something fiercely practical, like farming itself. Mary appeared at the doorway, wiping flour from her hands. "He says things like that," she said softly, smiling. "Never poetic, always true." Her gaze lingered on Greta with quiet warmth. That night, lying awake, Greta thought of every small act she'd witnessed. The trust, the partnership, the quiet equality that defined the Harrisons. It wasn't weakness. It was the purest strength she'd ever seen. By morning, the world seemed a little brighter. The snow had vanished completely, replaced by soft mud and stubborn buds pushing through the thawed earth. A quiet reminder that even frozen ground learns to bloom again. And as she walked toward the fields, Greta whispered the word that had changed everything for her, partnership, and realized it might be the first truly free word she had ever spoken aloud. The question had lingered in Greta's mind since that night in the barn. It followed her into the fields, into her dreams, echoing softly whenever she felt the Harrisons' kindness. Why didn't they hate her? Every morning she woke expecting the illusion to end. for someone to remember what she was, what her husband had fought for, what her people had done. But the storm never came. Instead, Frank greeted her with the same quiet, "Morning, ma'am," tipping his cap before heading to the stables. Mary offered coffee, warm and steady, as if kindness were as natural as breath. The thought unsettled Greta more than cruelty ever had. Mercy was disarming. It forced her to confront her guilt, to stand naked before grace she hadn't earned. It was a punishment wrapped in gentleness. One afternoon, while sorting feed, she found Frank repairing a broken fence post. The smell of sawdust hung in the air. He didn't look up when he said, "You still trying to figure us out?" Greta hesitated, unsure if it was safe to answer. "Yes," she admitted. "Where I come from, enemies don't forgive, they destroy." Frank drove a nail into the wood and replied quietly, "Maybe that's why we won." His words weren't arrogant, they were sad, reflective. "Winning," he continued, "ain't just about fighting harder. Sometimes it's about deciding not to become what you hate." The sentence struck her like scripture. For a long moment she said nothing. The hammering stopped, and the wind carried the faint smell of rain through the open fields. "You lost your brother," she said softly. It wasn't a question. Frank nodded. "Tommy, France, 44, 19 years old." His voice held no bitterness, only a tired acceptance that still hurt to hear. Greta looked at his hands, the same hands that could carry feed sacks and mend broken fences, and wondered how such strength could coexist with such restraint. "You should hate us," she whispered. Frank sighed. "Maybe once I did. But hate's like rust. It eats the tool, not the problem." He leaned against the fence, looking at the horizon as though measuring its patience. Later that evening, Mary found Greta in the kitchen, eyes red from silent tears. Without asking, she set a cup of tea beside her. "He doesn't talk about Tommy often," she said. "That means he trusts you." They sat together in the golden hush of dusk. The kettle hissed softly, and Greta thought of how strange it was to feel forgiven by people who had every reason to despise her. Mary stirred her tea, thoughtful. "Frank says the only way to honor the dead is to live the life they never got to finish. That's why we keep moving forward." Greta nodded, words caught in her throat. Forgiveness wasn't passive here. It was work. It was milking cows at dawn, mending fences, showing up day after day to prove one could still build. The next morning, she found a folded note on the kitchen table. "Heading into town for supplies. Take care of the chores." Just that. A sentence so simple, yet overflowing with trust. Greta stared at it for a long moment before tucking it into her apron. It wasn't just an instruction. It was an unspoken declaration. You belong enough to be trusted. That day she worked harder than ever, hauling water, feeding livestock, tending the garden. Not to repay kindness, but to live up to it. It was the first time she worked for hope, not survival. When Frank returned that evening, he said nothing about the work. He just nodded once, the ghost of a smile in his eyes. And Greta realized the question that haunted her had finally answered itself. They didn't hate her because hatred was easy, and the Harrisons had chosen the harder thing. They had chosen to build, not burn. And in doing so, they had rebuilt her too.